Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Welcome everyone to the webinar on global digital culture and identity in South Asia. I'm Reshma Patel, VP of Programming for the MIT South Asian Alumni Association. The MIT South Asian Alumni Association aims to connect the over 3,000 MIT alumni of South Asian descent and to highlight the work of South Asian faculty and alumni. Today, we will hear from 4 alumni of the MIT Comparative Media Studies program. Our moderator today is Professor of Media Studies, Ashwin Punathembekar, SM03, author of Bombay to Bollywood, Global Bollywood, and most recently, Global Digital Cultures and Perspectives from South Asia. Huma Yusuf, SM08, a journalist and a frequent contributor to the New York Times and the Pakistani newspaper Dawn. Parmesh Shahani, SM05, author of Disco Jalebi, Gay Bombay, and most recently, Queeristan, which is an incredible guidebook for anybody who is in HR or a CEO and talk about inclusive workplaces. He is also the founder of Godrej India Culture Lab. And last but not least is Rekha Malhotra, SM19, who is a cultural icon, author, curator, and activist, credited for popularizing Bhangra music in North America, but she has done so much more as an activist and an artist in New York City and globally. I encourage everyone to read more about the speakers in our event invite and read their books and follow their amazing work. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A feature in the webinar. And I will now turn it over to Ashwin.
Thank you, Reshma, and thank you to the MIT South Asia Alumni Association for organizing this event, for contacting each one of us and bringing this group together. And I also wanted to, before we begin, thank Professor Tuli Banerjee at MIT, who was initially going to join us, but had to, for personal reasons, couldn't make it today. But she's been a crucial mentor figure for all of us in CMS for many, many years now, and we wanted to acknowledge the incredible impact she's had on bringing South Asia and South Asianists together within the CMS program and at large at MIT. So Tuli, we hope to continue this conversation with you down the road. This is a really lovely opportunity for me to reconnect with some amazing CMS alums. And as we were going back and forth about the topic, we settled on this particular question of digital cultures from a South Asian and South Asian diasporic angle. Put it quite simply, I mean, digital platforms are truly everywhere, and they're now woven into the rhythms of our ordinary everyday life. And with state and both private investments in digital infrastructures and communication technologies more generally, leading to increased internet access the world over, it really seems impossible for us to imagine our present and the near future without us engaging with a range of digital platforms. And what we as CMS alums wanted to do was try and have a conversation about both the promises and the perils of digital platforms at this particular historical moment, not from the perspective of, say, technology companies or from a business angle necessarily, where there's breathless pronouncements about platform revolutions and disruption and so on. We wanted to bracket those kinds of ideas and those modes of thinking about digital culture. And instead, we wanted to foreground or rather situate digital in relation to 2 keywords. One of them being global, the other being culture. And the 3 participants here, Huma Yusuf, DJ Rekha, and Parmesh Shahani, I can't imagine better sort of conversation partners for this particular topic. So I'm going to quickly turn to each one of them, and they'll tell us a little bit about their work and their professional background and expertise. And we'll then jump into a conversation that really gets to the heart of the ways in which each one of them has grappled with both the opportunities that digital platforms have presented, but also struggling in interesting ways with the risks and the dangers of thoroughgoing digitalization. So I'm going to turn first, and I know these mosaics look different on different screens. On my particular screen, I'm going to turn to Huma Yusuf first.
Thanks very much, Ashwin, and so lovely. Just want to echo your thoughts. It's nice to be here back with the CMS crowd and to speak to sort of an MIT community again. I think I'll just quickly say that in some ways, I've been an investigative journalist based in Karachi, sort of, for a decade at this point. I've moved on and have sort of various research interests in the space of digital media, but the key concern, we talk about digital, we talk about global, we talk about the 21st century, but the key concerns for someone with my interests are actually quite old-fashioned. They come back to that space of media access, the complete inequality, the digital divide, which has stopped being a fashionable term, but in the lived reality of people consuming media, that continues to be the first point. Sort of gender inequality issues as they play out in terms of like different levels of safety that people have when engaging online, those become key concerns. And then good old-fashioned censorship and concerns about free press, fake news, all those issues. And so in some ways, what I'm always struck by is that while we have these debates and the jargon gets more sort of modern and ever complicated, the basic fundamentals of just access, safety, media literacy, and sort of empowered use of different platforms to essentially be able to express an identity and participate in a conversation at your terms continues to be the key concern. So I'll stop there, but hopefully we can pick up on some of that.
Fantastic, thank you. Rekha Malhotra, if I could turn to you next.
Classic. In terms of my connection to digital platforms, especially in the context of well, I'll do it in the context of my own work, and then just want to highlight something that's happening very, very right now that's of great concern, and I think is both benefiting and being hindered by platforms. So as a DJ, given the lockdown and the pandemic, I pivoted, like many people who do in-person live events, to using platforms and being dependent on existing platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, etc. And while they opened up great possibilities and definitely opened up geographically engagement and has an intimacy of engagement, we're also at the mercy of their copyright laws. DJs use existing music. So there was as Huma said, digital divide. There was a digital divide amongst artists of who were being able to do those things and not. And so there's that one element of it and I also, in addition to DJing, performing, I also learned quickly how to produce events. So one of the big things I was involved with was a fundraiser for Biden-Harris, which we had 1,800 people at once, which took a lot of effort and energy, and just how that functioned, it was a lot of work and a lot of learnings from that. But I want to shift for a minute to things that have often plagued the nation state, which is the community outside the homeland. And we're looking at the farmers' issues and the strikes that are happening in India, and how much the Punjabi diaspora is active in amplifying that message, when from my point of view, I don't really see South Asian or Indian media necessarily, because of the threat of the government itself, amplifying the message. So there's a great mobilization and use of platforms to amplify the plight and the struggle of farmers. Now, this is the diaspora really mobilizing, and this has happened, through the years in terms of Ghadar Party and other things that have happened specifically to India. And I guess if we're talking about Indian Pakistani independence, so those movements happened before, but they're taking a different, they're manifesting differently because they're aided by platforms. So yeah, those are my thoughts right now.
Great, thank you. Parmesh, Shahani.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'd be happy just staring at all of you and saying nothing, because I've missed all of you so much. What I've been doing in the past, since CMS, is taking this philosophy of applied humanities that we learned, and actually applying it in the business world. The past decade, I've been at a company called Godrej, which is a 125-year-old Indian company, and working here as vice president on the corporate side, working on various aspects of leadership, but also running an experimental space called the Godrej India Culture Lab, which both Rekha and Ashwin, you've visited, Huma you haven't. So hopefully at some point you will as well. And it's been very interesting to kind of seed from within, a capitalistic corporate space, this hybrid kind of platform that serves to talk about issues which don't normally get enough airtime in contemporary India. And so, it's been very interesting over the past decade to be running this as an experiment, while also working on the academic side of me, which, also CMS kind of birthed. This pandemic has been interesting in looking at some of these issues. Because in the past decade, I've also been working a lot on LGBTQ inclusion, in workplaces. We've had, with regard to LGBTQ rights in India, we've had a very tumultuous past 20 years, which finally in 2018 culminated with yet again, and hopefully this is the last time, the doing away of Section 377. And I say this because, we never know. Each time we say this law is gone and it comes back again. So hopefully this is it. Section 377, which decriminalized being LGBTQ in India. And I decided, around that time to focus my efforts on what would a post 377 India look like. And while there are many activists working in other spaces, whether it's healthcare, law, and so many others, I decided to focus on LGBTQ inclusion in workplaces. And so this new book is out, which is what I've been up to, Queeristan, which, imagines, yes. And Queeristan is an affectionate name for an LGBTQ inclusive India, which I say is already emerging around us in various forms. I think platforms are interesting because, with me, at least in the past few months, a lot has happened. Like with Rekha, with the Culture Lab, we pivoted to digital programming, but we took a call in October that it's not working.
Sorry to interrupt. Parmesh, do you want to try turning the video off for a few seconds just to help with bandwidth issues?
Sure.
And if you could go back about 20 seconds and talk. Yes, and if you could just restart about the call you made in October in relation. Sorry, not in October, in April and May about using platforms and digital programming for the India Culture Lab.
Well, the timing of this is perfect because this video glitch is exactly what I was talking about, right? Not everything can transform to digital. I did not engineer this. Not everything can translate to digital. With us at the Culture Lab, we had so many people who were coming to our events, for example, who would read about it in the newspaper or read about it in the local language press, Hindi or Marathi. There would be older people who would come in, students who would come in. So the lab was, as much as we do digital things, it was also, it continues to be very much a physical space. And so while we pivoted in March, March, April to saying, let's do stuff on Zoom and Insta Lives and, what everyone else is doing, we realized that, over the next few months, because so many people are working so much online, that, by the end of the day, in terms of cultural, sustenance, there is certainly fatigue. So we took a call in October to actually go on a long sabbatical until the world figures itself out, and then decide in what form to re-emerge, perhaps in an all analog form, given that there is going to be so much digital platformication happening between now and whenever the pandemic ends. that perhaps the charm and beauty of doing something analog might be more interesting. So maybe we can talk about that as well. But it's been interesting in terms of the book. The book has found audiences and seminars and that reach via digital. But I think with other things one has to reconsider. And of course, my video is back just as I made my point. Yeah.
No, these are perfect introductions, and I think all three of you have touched on ways of thinking through your work in relation to the digital. That takes me back to the core seminar on media and transition that William Uricchio used to teach, right? So I want to pick up on two themes and have each one of you reflect on that, if you could. This sort of deep ambivalence that each one of us feels in relation to decidedly commodified platform economies, right? Insta, Facebook, no matter what we're talking about, WhatsApp in the South Asian case in particular, and so on. And I'm going to maybe start with Rekha, if I can, because you have a history here of having launched what we should regard at this point as a cultural institution, Basement Bhangra, right? And you worked in the music scene precisely in that in-between space between a highly corporatized music industry and an entirely grassroots sort of thing, somewhere in between perhaps. And now you're again sort of thinking through the same sort of problem of how do we work with platform companies in ways that we can stay true to our work, engage with community organizers, engage with activist communities, while also not dismissing these platform companies as entirely serving other kinds of interests. So if you could reflect on that sort of history you've had of occupying this in-between space, that would be a great way to start, perhaps.
Sure. My previous dependency on platforms, I did start at a time when the only digital engagement was email. And even when I started, we did not even do marketing on email. We just did physical flyers. We're at the mercy of the platforms now. And we don't have a lot of agency. And, whether, even in something very local politics in terms of what I face where I live in Jackson Heights and in Queens and in New York City is, there was a strong opposition to Amazon building a second headquarters here. And there was a lot of fight and, they left in the middle of the night. But when we use web servers, we're using AWS.
AWS, yeah.
So there's so much behind. And if we look at, there's so much what we don't see in the back end that we don't control. And I think it's a challenge, like now DJs are pivoting to Twitch, which is a gamer platform. And it's owned by Amazon. And they also have copyright. Their terms of service also prohibits copyright. And they're doing what's been frequently done to garner communities, which is they're not enforcing their rules to generate, to get people to join. And then they, at any point, arbitrarily can enforce their rules. So they'll build an audience and then start doing takedowns. And I think it's pretty devastating. I mean, as an artist, you don't know when or where you're going to be taken down. And we don't have the facilities to create alternatives. And, I think platforms need to be viewed differently. They've escaped governance, especially in the United States, in a deep, deep way. And they just glide along and there's no governance around them really. So, and in the case of the pandemic, the technology is moving faster than the regulation or whatever things need to gird or temper the experience in what way. So, I don't know there are alternatives. And I echo Pramesh, like, we pivoted, but it's not the same. So much of what I do relies on physical presence and reading a crowd. It's very strange to DJ in your apartment. And you don't have that energy or that vibe. And it's very challenging. So.
Now, this question that you raised about the very, very circumscribed agency that any of us has in relation to this platform economy, that sort of that's something that Huma brought up early on in the introduction, right? And this question of governance really takes on an interesting dimension within South Asia too, right? Not just within the diaspora and in the US, where there was a famous case in Pakistan a few years ago where the state took down YouTube. They invoked sort of religious sentiments and so on, something we've heard on and on. But then there was this fascinating civil society initiative called hashtag HoloBC, BC being an expletive that we don't need to use in this particular community. And there was this wonderful video that a group shot where a man wearing a YouTube branded cube was walking the streets, maybe in Karachi, maybe in Lahore, I'm not sure, where he said, if you would like YouTube back, come give a hug to this branded cube. And so it was this really fascinating moment where the deep affect and longing for YouTube as a source of, joy, pleasure, archiving, and so on that everyday citizens felt was directly in sort of opposed to what the Pakistani state was doing. And like you pointed out, Rekha, YouTube's terms of service just went away. People were distressed that the archives they had digitized and put up just vanished overnight. So that's the kind of ambivalence that I wanted to maybe think about a little bit more that you brought out so beautifully, Rekha. And maybe Huma, you could jump in at this point and say a little bit from your perspective, especially from questions to do with gender and platform economies.
Yeah, I'll come to the gender bit in a second, but I did just want to complicate that we really do spend a lot of our time critiquing these platforms and sort of the corporate power, the lack of, privacy, the tracking, the surveillance issues, etc., from the corporate perspective. But when you take it into an environment such as Pakistan, we find ourselves in this completely sort of topsy-turvy universe where we're turning to the platforms and we're turning to their corporate might in specific, almost to sort of save our ability to access these platforms and then to access them in that sort of more urgent sense of not just sort of access for the sake of personal engagement and archiving and joy and sort of the social part of social media, but also then for the broader purpose of documenting, narrativizing journalism, citizen journalism, reporting human rights violations, etc., and the sort of more democratic aspect, long ago in the early 2000s, what we were talking about when we started to talk about this media. And so right now, in fact, it's a very live issue in Pakistan. We have a situation where the state is really seeking to introduce really draconian internet legislation that would essentially make it mandatory for international tech companies of the likes of Amazon, Google, Twitter, etc., to maintain local servers and give up information about users and the content on those platforms to the Pakistani government. And in response to that, all the big sort of platforms, Twitter, Amazon, Google, etc., have come together in something called the Asia Internet Coalition, and they're pushing back and they're essentially saying, if you ask this of us, we will leave. And so they have become, in a weird way, the sort of voice of sanity, the sort of human rights and sort of democracy debate around what these platforms were meant to represent, which is in complete sort of disconnect with, I know, all the debates that are happening, for example, in the US right now with for example, Facebook's role in the US election, which has been hugely criticized and coming under fire now. And so I think that disconnect is something that the different environments within which these platforms are being used and the different things that they start to represent in moments of time becomes a bit more interesting. And then just to sort of close on the gender point you raised, and I think there also we're finding that at the exact same time that people, so there's a term in Pakistan, and I know there's equivalents in India, but sort of like the liberal fascist, it's what you call someone who's sort of pro-democracy, pro-human rights, inclusive, pro-free media, pro-free speech. And the liberal fascists, so-called, on Twitter are sort of rallying and really turning to recognizing that the Asia Internet Coalition might be the thing that saves any sort of access to sort of open platforms and democratic use of social media platforms, digital platforms going forward. But at the same time, those same people are having to really critique the way that these platforms are set up, because one of the biggest problems, and there's an amazing movement going on in Pakistan right now, is to acknowledge the amount of online harassment and abuse and threats of women, and particularly women journalists who are particularly on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And it's an issue that has been taken up sort of globally. It was taken up in sort of, Parliament acknowledged it, and then it went up and has been sort of picked up by sort of global journalism journalism safety organizations and global women's rights groups, etc., just sort of recognizing the level of threat and how much it sort of stifles debate. And a lot of the critique there actually does come to the way that those platforms are structured and the way that they do enable a kind of like hate speech and targeting to continue. And so people find themselves almost speaking out of both sides of the two corners of your mouth, saying contradictory things, but that's the space we inhabit.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to sort of nuance the debate a little bit more. And maybe Parmesh can jump in here at this point, because what both of you have said so far, one of the things that's worth noting is that platforms are not static entities, right? So if you look at a platform like Facebook in the Indian context, what it was in 2010 is very different from what it is now, in the sense that the kinds of partnerships they've built, not just with with business entities, but with powerful political parties, makes it a very different thing itself. So when it comes to things like community standards, questions of misogyny online, and so on, it's almost a losing battle, sort of trying to figure out ways to get these platforms to curate and better moderate and so on. But I'm sure Parmesh has a lot to say on this front, because you've used platforms to grow India Culture Lab into this truly national institution, right?
Yeah, but also just building on what Rekha and Huma said as well, right? I mean, they're both spaces of liberation. So in Queeristan, for example, I talk about Tinder, and Tinder is also a platform, and Tinder comes. I advised Tinder on the 26 gender identities that they could introduce in India, a couple of years earlier, among so many others. And spaces like Tinder are leading the way in having more nuanced conversations about gender and parsing it into so many different ways. TikTok, we talk about TikTok, and there's a whole bit about the book where I talk about how queer people, especially non-English speaking queer people from smaller towns, in India, have really used TikTok to visibilize same-sex love, desire, to as a form of both mimicry and hybridity. How can we have like so many South Asians on a panel and not bring in Homi Baba? That's my question. But and hi Homi. Homi is hovering everywhere. Apadira will come in just a moment. I can see it. But the way, right, with the lip sync, with the camera pan, using these, the TikTok tropes, as well as extremely heteronormative, idealized versions of what, it means to be in a relationship. But so much of this has been produced over time that I think, TikTok has done more to like push forward the conversation for, LGBTQ inclusion, as much as a Supreme Court judgment, or as much as an Ek Ladki Ko Dekha, with Sonam Kapoor, or, as much as an Aamir Khan TV show and all of that, right? So I'm saying, yeah, so it is ambivalence, right? On one side, you love the platforms. At the Culture Lab as well, we've used all of them to push, to archive some of what we, do in terms of live events, to give them an afterlife, to promote them. But we do it with deep awareness that, they come inbuilt with constraints. They have their own surveillance issues. And, the larger questions of who's not having, who are we not reaching in terms of this, right? Because, who is having access, who's not having access? Are we talking in echo chambers? Ultimately, is the transcend, to other audience? And so we, one way that we thought of it was using different. So, WhatsApp audiences will be different from Insta audiences, for example. But then again, I mean, I think this ambivalence is something which is a CMS legacy itself, right? You can't have a bunch of CMS people and not be ambivalent, because I think it was hardwired into us. And I think that's a good thing. It's what will keep us agile, nimble, always slightly suspicious, and always slightly hopeful.
Yeah, no, that's one way to go about it, right? Is at which moments do we invoke or work with the politics of suspicion, and in which contexts do we work with the politics of hope, right? And one thing doesn't necessarily cancel out the other. Both things can be true, and we work precisely at that sort of intersection of those two ways of thinking about and being and inhabiting this digital world. And one of the things that both you, Parmesh, and Rekha brought up was this, because you both do these events and you put them on, one of the keywords that everyone's grappling with is curation, right? That we are at the mercy of recommender systems. We're at the mercy of algorithmic curation. We're at the mercy of computational processes in terms of who gets to produce certain things and how some things get privileged over others, some voices. So for example, with TikTok India, the way in which it had become such a crucial vernacular space for rural, working poor, range of other kinds of communities that elite journalists simply couldn't grasp. So that's just one small example that comes to mind. So I just wanted to maybe turn the conversation a little bit to this question of curation. So as curators, Rekha, Parmesh, and then Huma, as somebody who follows the debate around curation, how would you begin to approach this particular topic?
So I think, everything is curated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even what we're doing here. And there are algos, the machine is constantly generating suggestions and recommendation systems. I was actually part of a company called Black Planet, which has a lot of, it's sort of resurfacing, its importance is sort of resurfacing a little bit in media study circles. And it was basically the functionality of Facebook, everything, but it was for niche. It was for African Americans and then Asian Americans, and then they launched a Spanish language site called Mi Gente. They created community in a certain way, but back then we were really interested in recommendation systems. And I just remember this, and this is in 2000. And the thought of recommendation systems actually happening seems so far-fetched. Like, how could you get there? And now we can get there. I mean, I also was consulting for Spotify, but right before they launched for India, because we were trying to clean up the data in a way that it would work. I will have to believe, and I firmly believe, you can't automate everything. As a DJ, I'm gonna have to stand by the artistic hand, has to be there. And as we vie for space and the challenges of artistry exist in any medium, hand curation or non-algorithmic curation will still have value. And I do think in terms of the hope side, like, we can all be down on platforms. I see tremendous communities emerging globally that have been aided by needing to reach out beyond your physical geographic space. And I see in India too, I mean, and in Pakistan, so much independent music making, so much communication. I mean, Instagram, you see somebody, you can DM them right away. They may not respond, but so many, and this has happened on Twitter, and collaborations and things about access to artistic communities. And, in India, there's such a thriving independent music scene. I'm thinking of Box FM. There's these whole network of podcasts that are developing, and podcasting also is growing as an audio medium of connection. And some of these are facilitated by large companies like Spotify and Saavn and other digital music platforms that are also doing podcasting. But you need the artists, you need the community to use them. If they're not there, then these things don't actually survive or function. And it's always a balance between, I think even the companies that run these platforms, they know the benefit of having actual creators involved in a very fundamental way. So, I mean, there's the hope part, there's some really great alternative systems that have been created to cultivate cultural engagement. And curation, I believe you cannot automate all of curation, and my Spotify Wrapped was terrible. It did not capture anything that I was really doing. So sorry, Spotify.
Yeah, no, I think you captured that really well, because if you take a platform like YouTube, for example, within South Asia, from sort of a historical angle, I can trace a line from 80s audio cassette culture to YouTube in terms of the range of users and the kinds of artists who've been most successful. You have, let's say, a group like an incredibly progressive group like the Castless Collective using YouTube in phenomenally interesting ways. But you also have incredibly reactionary Hindutva pop artists using the same platform. And you see this sort of dilemma work itself out in other moments of media transition as well, through the early audio cassette and video cassette era. And that's where I think the CMS sort of perspective, where we have to take those histories into account if we are to figure out what is the response to these incredibly divergent uses of the same media technology that's shaping all kinds of circulations. And this is where I think the work that Huma you do becomes so crucial, because you're sort of this in-between figure. You engage in these communities, and then as a journalist, you grapple with these debates for a large audience of readers, right? You try to figure out, okay, how do we make sense of this in a context like Pakistan or India or other diasporic contexts as well?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there to say, I mean, I think whenever we talk about curation, I sort of go back to that access point and the media literacy points, where I think that for, all of us who are speaking today and most of the, people who are listening to us this evening, they understand that there's an algorithm driving what pops up next on their Netflix or on their YouTube, or, or who their recommended friends, etc. are. But for a lot of sort of people who are just coming onto these platforms, even youth, even urban middle class youth in a place like Pakistan, they don't really understand what they are dealing with when they come on board. And so the fact that the curation is not visible or transparent to them, I think creates that sort of, misperception in terms of what sort of community they're engaging in. And also, I think some of those issues around their sense of trust in that community, and not sort of being able to recognize when they are vulnerable, when they're exposed, when they're exploited, whether it be commercially, whether it be politically, etc. So I do think that continues to be a real tension that is very interesting to me. But then the other point I wanted to make is that, of course, while the algorithms are at work, there's also the sort of, the culture that, particularly in the South Asian context, has really taken off, which is the whole aspect of trolling, of sort of fighting the algorithm with your armies and armies of online trolls who will put out, and it tends to typically be sort of either political messaging from a certain ideological bent, or it'll be sort of religious groups trying to promote a certain kind of sort of, violent or inflammatory or sectarian ideology. And those groups know how to fight the algorithm, and it's by just getting hundreds of people tweeting or retweeting or pushing back. And it's increasingly, and what's interesting is that in some ways South Asia, where we think about what I've just said, I'm going to contradict myself back to our CMS ambivalence, that, people are starting to realize the power of that, the fighting the algorithm. So how do you shut down a news story? How do you clamp down when something interesting or provocative or joyful that doesn't really fit with the state narratives or a religious, point of view or narrative starts to come up, and it's you unleash those trolls. And now we're starting to see the next phase evolve in the South Asian context, where the trolls are being corporatized, where they themselves are being, they're setting up. You can actually be hired and paid very well as a young university graduate to work as a troll. And I think these dynamics of people simultaneously engaging with these media and these platforms and feeling quite empowered by what they can do with it, but not sort of recognizing how they remain then at the mercy of other forces, is also an interesting dynamic for me.
Yeah, no, when we talk about how we think about South Asia as part of a global digital culture, this other side often goes under we don't pay enough attention to this side of labor, right? The entire content moderation world is sort of rests on a large thousands of young professionals, and the psychological toll on these young professionals in South Asia and other parts like the Philippines is just incredible. And there've been a few interesting documentaries that Vice did to sort of pull back the veil on this kind of phenomenon as well. But this other sort of underbelly of platform moderation is just as much a part of the South Asian digital story as all the other things that we've been mentioning. Yeah. Parmesh, did you want to jump in on the curation question? Because you've sort of fashioned yourself, and you've been so brilliant precisely at this question of curating, and in doing that, transforming any assumptions anyone may have had about what Indian culture is, so to speak.
Yeah, completely. And echoing Huma and DJ and Rekha, I think to me curation has always been about the unexpected. And it's unexpected connections that you can draw between ideas that may not, that an algorithm may not be able to, because algorithms look for patterns. Unexpected collaborations that you can, foster. And that comes from having, an understanding of the context, right? And that context keeps on changing. So just, with our Culture Lab for 10 years, we've looked at feminism, almost every year, a different conference around the idea of, feminism. And it keeps on changing every year, right? Because changes because we collaborate with someone different every time. So when we collaborate with Nisha, Susan, and Lady's Finger, then the conference is called Wandering Women. And it's a very different take on feminism than when we collaborate with Urvashi Butalia and Zuban Books, for example, right? And that particular one we call So Many Feminisms. Now, all together, and I think that's also what CMS tells you to take that long-term view. If you look at, our feminist programming, and if you start looking at all of it over the course of 10 years, then you start connecting the dots, and then you start whatever, right? But I think so this kind of thing is something that there is value of expertise. There is value of people who know the ground. There is value of people who are able to look, who are able to forge connections, between people who live in different silos. And also people who are able to look at the margins, because a lot of the exciting ideas are in the margins, right? Mm-hmm. So we were talking about platforms earlier. To me, some of the most exciting things about Queer India are the ones that the mainstream media is either willfully ignoring or is just unaware of, right? Some of the most exciting projects, whether it's Dalit Queer Project, whether it's Queer Muslim Project, whether it's Sandeep Nagar, which is, with Grace Banu, the trans activist in Tamil Nadu, is building a dairy cooperative with hundreds of trans people who have come together to create a farm together with the support of the state government and private corporations, right? To me, it's a template for the future of, win-win collaborations where everyone wins. The government wins, citizens win, companies win. But mainstream media often will not focus on these things, right? And that's when you need the digital platforms to kind of both everything, to fundraise for these things through things like Keto or Kickstarter, to amplify their work, whether it's through an Instagram, YouTube, etc., or whatever. And then I think then the role comes of people like us, right, who have our finger on the pulse to say, how does, like with me, the question is, why should Grace Banu be talking only to other activists and other well-meaning people, right? So then how do you create those juxtapositions where Grace Banu can be speaking to company CEOs and saying, look, this is the possibility. Here's where you need to be thinking about these things or whatever, right? With the government or with whatever. So my point is, I think the role of people like us, trained in the humanities, but able to see the larger picture as curators, is especially vital, in the world of today and tomorrow, in the post-COVID world of today and tomorrow, where I would think that our skills and our background and our ability to, see larger connections makes us vital problem solvers.
No, I like this.
So I'm not against technology or platforms. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I like the way you put that, sort of, thinking of certain figures, including yourself, Parmesh, and Rekha, and Human, others, as sort of mediating personas, right, who occupy this space and go back and forth. But, I'm going to move a little bit away from our instincts of being historically grounded and so on, and ask you all to also think about turning points. There are sort of moments in which things do shift, and you can discern those moments, right? Maybe perhaps only in hindsight or so on. But I wanted to pick up on that because both Rekha and Huma, you said there's something happening in the present moment that is perhaps forcing you to change the way you think about digital platforms, digital culture. Rekha, you talked about the farmers movement that's unfolding as we speak, and the way you connected it to a long-standing connection between South Asia and its diaspora. So can we think a little bit for the next few minutes before we turn to the Q&A about these crucial turning points that have forced you in your different roles to perhaps change the way you think about what digital platforms and just digital technologies in general have the capacity to do, but where you also pick up on some of the risks where things might not unfold the way you hope they might?
I mean, I think, let's getting back to CMS thinking, the medium is the message, the medium dictates in so many ways how the art is manifested at times, and the art pushes what the medium is intended to do or not do. So when we find there's a huge history of marginalized communities hacking and manipulating all kinds of technology and platforms. That's what DJing is. It's a manipulation of a physical object in a different way to create, seamless music, like two turntables continue the experience of music in a way that's not intended. So I think, it's great hearing Parmesh talk about how queerness finds a space in these places, and that's true always. In the beginning of the pandemic, Zoom parties were happening, and it was a very important space for queer connections in New York, which those physical parties were also very important. And there's a crew here called Poppy Juice, and they were doing a bunch of Zoom parties, as were many other queer communities. And in terms of, I think for me, just to be specific, DJing, pivoting from live to streaming is a moment, is an experience, and I think we will look at that in a certain way, and it's definitely changed the experience for better or for worse in some ways. I don't think that's going to go away. I think there's something about that will remain. How it will, what will happen to it, I'm not sure. But that to me is one flashpoint for sure, specifically DJing and dance parties and what that means. So for me, I'm no spring chicken, and a lot of my audience has aged out of going out to clubs, and I refound them again because they were able to, be at home with their kids or whatever and partake. So that was a way to reconnect with something that happened that might not have happened in the same way. So, I mean, I'll just put that forth.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to it in the Q&A. That's a really, and like you said, I think we'll have to reflect on this, not in the moment, but maybe 2-5 years from now, and look back at this transition. Yeah, Huma and Parmesh, what would you identify as really interesting turning points that changed your thinking about all things digital?
I think that there was, when I left CMS, I had started to work on a project, essentially a sort of, initially a research project, which started to become a book project on Pakistani media identity and power, and essentially making a very optimistic argument about how sort of digital media platforms were essentially going to usher in this wave of democratic change, and that Pakistan would never be the same again, and that despite the digital divide, etc., we would see sort of a transparency and a sort of more diverse and inclusive debate about sort of the future and the vision of the country in a way that had never been possible before, and that would lead to something interesting. 12 years later, that book has not finished because the entire argument has been put on its head, where what started as an optimistic story has become a very pessimistic story, where, as I've talked about in many ways, the state capture of all these spaces, there's clampdown, there's scrutiny, there's trolling, tracking, trafficking. It's not a safe space anymore. And I think for me, this idea of safety, I know it's a word that I've used a lot, and it's a strange one. It's not one that comes up a lot when you're talking about something like digital platforms, where we've started to really think about how disembodied these spaces are and how, people have alter egos and personas and fantasy worlds, etc. And you think of it as an escapist place, not one where you go and become sort of vulnerable and more exposed. But one of the most interesting turning points for me recently has been that realization that as sort of real world became more prohibitive, particularly for people who were engaged in any kind of dissent or state critique, people in the journalistic community, etc., as they faced threats, not just from the state, but also in Pakistan's context, from sort of violent extremist groups, the Taliban militancy over sort of 2007 to 2014, everyone started to retreat online. So the idea was that if you were just doing something, if you were speaking on Twitter, if you were able to publish online, if you had a website, if you were able to physically go into exile, so leave Pakistan and get asylum in the EU, but then from there, continue to write, continue to blog, continue to tweet, that in a way you were safer, that you were using this sort of these digital platforms as a way both to secure your safety, but also continue to have that voice and sort of have the best of both worlds. And we recently had a case where a sort of Pakistani activist who'd been involved in sort of highlighting and sort of presenting the viewpoints of the Baloch, which is it's an ethnic group in southwestern Pakistan who have been waging in a long-running sort of low-level insurgency, and they demand more provincial autonomy, and they can certain nationalist and separatist groups within that community have quite anti-state views. And in one of these people in Sweden was actually murdered. And the sort of chilling effect that had, that you can physically leave a space and still sort of be silenced, and it's for work that you were doing in an online space, which in itself is being blocked, censored. I mean, his work was not accessible anywhere because of the amount of sort of web blocking and censoring, etc., that was going on. But that I think was quite a turning point, which was that where does one retreat now? Where you are concerned about the fact that we moved from in real life to digital, and then sort of what comes next. And I think that's what I'm now starting to be more intrigued by. And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen with the pandemic was this feeling that, the answer to that question used to be, well, we go back to basics. We start to pamphleteer, we start to talk in real life again, we meet in cafes. And on the other side, for radical groups, you meet, at the front of the mosque or in the madrasa, or so that everyone had their version of the safe space in their conception of it. But when the pandemic even takes that away from you, then what's left? And that's what I'm now interested in thinking about.
Yeah, Parmesh?
Yeah, very much, because we've had in India, we're familiar with how each week, in terms of civil liberties, it seems like a very topsy-turvy world, suddenly. And in the US, until, recently, or who knows, Trump might still come back. Until he's really gone. He's not really gone. I think my thing was, how do you just make sense of a topsy-turvy world in general, right? When people who should be in jail are running countries, people who should be award-winning people are in jail, people who speak the truth, are banned, blocked, trolled, killed, people who tell lies are celebrated. So just, I think just on a daily basis, this reconciliation of the absurdity of the daily normal, I think has been a turning point. But in each of, it's been a very tough decade to reconcile, right? All around the world, in the different parts of the world in which we are, we've all seen the rise of, a very particular kind of intolerance, which, is unified, I think, globally. It has so many, common elements as well, right? And people who kind of believe in conversation, working across silos, collaborations have been very, I think, dumbstruck by the ferocity of this particular kind of intolerance, right? How do you, So my turning point has been just the realization, as I'm sure many have before, that it is really a long struggle, that in this long struggle, we have to sometimes self-preservation, whether of one's mental health, life, or other things are as important. Where does one look for hope? How does one sustain it within oneself and within others? How does one create infrastructures of possibility for that, digital as well as analog? So it's not one particular thing which is, but it's like a long realization that the romantic ideals that perhaps we had of changing the world might have to be tempered. But again, none of this seems new. Maybe it's just old age. Maybe this is just a recognition that this is what
Middle age, Baba, middle
feeling.
age, not old age.
This is what it means.
No, I mean, it's a crucial thing you bring up, Parmesh, right? And despite this note we're ending on about a serious sort of sense of skepticism about structural change and political change and so on, what each one of you, if I look back on the incredible work that each one of you has done, I think in addition to this thing we were talking about earlier about, do we bring a lens of suspicion or trust to these kinds of digital projects, digital infrastructures and platforms? In different ways, each one of you has also produced what I might call sort of communities of care, right? So in other words, there's also a politics of care that all three of you have been deeply invested in, and you've put an incredible effort to use in very creative ways with the ambivalence, with the caution and so on, that you've produced infrastructures of care that will hopefully, however fragile they might be, will be the things that will last and sustain themselves. And hopefully, there will also be a generational renewal of those, right? And I think that may have been what Rekha was talking about when you organized the Biden-Harris sort of moment, that's what you see there, that it is a generational renewal that at the end of the day, we are invested in. It's not necessarily pinned to our personal sort of trajectories that we will see change but in our lifetimes. But that's where it seems to me that the CMS lesson of taking the long view, of being skeptical yet investing in creating in whatever ways possible these pockets of care is perhaps the modest yet crucial work that all three of you have been doing and that you've reflected on so beautifully today in the last 1 hour. And at this point, should we continue this conversation by turning to some of the questions as well? Because I think some of the questions that have come in will, I think, will lead to more reflections from all of you. So I'm going to start with one question that Kavya Ravichandran has posted about this question of the role that massive multinational corporations and platforms have in different contexts. And she gets to the heart of the debate, which is to say, how do we hold these platforms to certain standards, but also what role do context-specific regulatory guidelines have to play? In other words, are there universal values and ideals we can hang on to in relation to these digital spaces, or in what ways do they need to be context-specific policy actions? Would anyone like to jump in sort of first? I mean, you've all reflected on this in your work over the last decade or so.
Can you say that again, Ashwin? Like,
sure. I think what Kavya is trying to get to the heart of is this dialectic between the universal and the local. In other words, what kinds of standards do we hold a platform like WhatsApp to, or Facebook, or Tinder, or Instagram, any of them?
I mean,
how, in other words, what role does context play in the way in which civil society groups, artists, the states themselves struggle to come up with regulatory guidelines?
I think in the case of the United States, there's some fundamental structural issues around society that find themselves into these platforms that need to be addressed. Structural racism needs to be addressed. Class oppression needs to be addressed. And we see that manifesting everywhere. We do also see people fighting back against it, and I think, it's so big and so huge to understand, and even the sort of language of standards and societies are very, in and of itself, to me, has this tinge of moral policing, which, you know, may not be intended. And I'm just trying to say, like, there, especially, you know, I mean, I can speak for the US context, is like, there needs to be a reckoning between, you know, the fact that, you know, structural racism, slavery, you know, and now we're entering a world where we have a different kind of slavery that's international, which is we have a gig economy that's pervasive, which makes slavery more efficient, you know? So we haven't touched upon that in terms of platforms and labor, because it's fueled by tremendous, you know, swats of money. And the money behind all of this is really important. So it's so hard, that's such a huge and large question. The one thing I did want to bring up before we end in terms of positive moments and flashpoints is that the work of awareness around caste has definitely been deftly utilized and amplified through, you know, digital media strategies globally, and the, you know, especially as those things transfer, you know, they transfer to the diaspora. And, you know, the Equality Labs has done tremendous work there, and even getting, you know, there's like people learning about it in a deeper way. So
in
I
fact,
just think that's also,
Dame Marie Soundarajan, the Equality
yes,
Lab, she was at CMS, and I was very
she
fortunate that
was,
she was
oh,
not as a student, but she
oh,
spent time
yes,
at
yes,
MIT, and
yes,
we intersected at that time. And yeah, I would
okay,
give a shout out to Equality Labs for sure. And then within South Asia, of course, all kinds of other really, really crucial anti-caste Dalit initiatives. Yeah, no, but that question that point you just made is critical to answering this question, which is ideas about what constitute speech are so need to be so carefully calibrated on each platform in different sorts of ways that any attempt at universalizing standards of regulation are bound to meet with all kinds of problems immediately, right? And even within the American context, the ways in which white nationalists have used digital platforms in very creative ways, we have to grant that they're reactionary but creative, is the kinds of coded language that algorithms can never hope to grasp, right? And so that's where the context specific, like Rekha and all of you have been pointing out, the human hand has to play an absolutely critical role if we are to start figuring out how community standards, those teams within these companies, are to be dealt with, right? Sorry, Parmesh, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just thinking of Empire, Heart and Negri. And I was thinking very much of how, you know, I mean, I think I really like Ranu's questions because, you know, but I think to think of corporations as anything more or anything less than, you know, acting in their enlightened self-interest all the time would be to ascribe too much to them. Which is why it's very nice, I suppose, for, and Huma, it's nice for maybe 5 US tech companies to get together and stand for something in Pakistan, you know, when the market might not be as big. But I don't see them doing it here in India, for example, where the market is just too big for them to, like, you know. So maybe their calculus in their mind is, you know, okay, if we lose the Pakistan market, so what? We'll look good standing up for free speech in Pakistan, but we can't afford to lose India because, you know, then it really affects the bottom line as well, right? So I would say to think of, and I say this by being placed inside a corporation, right? So I mean, and working with companies all the time as well, and pushing them to be the best versions of themselves. But I don't tell them you be angels. I say be the best version of yourself. And the yourself that they are is, I mean, they're companies. So all these multinational things are companies. What are they interested in, right? So I much prefer just, I mean, I've written a whole book and I feel just so stupid writing it, right? A whole book arguing for everything to make organizations more inclusive, except the fact that it's a decent thing to do, right? There's no the human rights argument of fact, oh my God, everyone should be treated equally, is almost absent in this book. Instead, there is, you can make money from us, we'll make you innovative. I mean, all these reasons to get them to say that it's in your interest. And I do that very consciously, right? Because to ascribe anything more than that they would think beyond the enlightened self-interest is, I think, naive. If they have to be contextual in places where they need to be contextual, they will be. When they can afford to be on a high horse and say, we are standing for values, they will be. They will do whatever it takes. And so we have to recognize that aspect of them, understand that structurally people who want to bring about change are unequal. We are not on an equal footing. So from this position of inequality, what do we have? I think, that it's an unequal struggle.
And also,
and that's what I want to offer, just this cognizance of the fact.
Yeah. No, and just to sort of put on the table the fact that in some parts of the world, in Hong Kong, for example, there are thriving communities of academics working with activist communities to imagine platform cooperatives. In other words, they're trying to model what a platform co-op sort of approach might begin to look like in a world in which basically we're looking at platform imperialism in a new sort of guise, right? So those experiments may not go very far in terms of becoming viable, sustainable alternatives to what we have, but those experiments are crucial for, at least like you just did, Parmesh, posing that question and forcing all of us to look outside of the existing model to say what else is possible. Right? Sorry, Huma, please.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of agree with Parmesh's point that yes, of course, the Pakistan example is a good one where those companies could take the moral high ground because it isn't such a major market yet, and they win a lot of brownie points for it. And then in addition to that, there's also an inherent sort of racism or Islamophobia built into the ease with which certain markets can be discounted, and the sort of bad behavior of those certain markets is much easier to take a quick position on, whereas with other markets where you don't have that inbuilt knee-jerk sort of either racist or biased response on another basis, you might struggle a bit more with how to react, driven by the commercial sort of counter argument. But I also just wanted to this question of, there was so much to say in that moment when this question of universal versus local came up. That one point we haven't touched on is also that I think that universal itself no longer really exists as a sort of position we can go at, because just to go with the Pakistan story, what's likely to happen is that at some point, if the state is quite serious about just getting the sort of complete control of this digital space, then they can actually quite easily ask these tech giants to exit stage left and work with Chinese companies that would be more than happy to work on the terms that the government wants to work on, and who are actually bringing a completely different ethos in terms of how digital infrastructure should operate and how it should be sort of participating in this state-driven surveillance and scrutiny and environment. And so from that perspective, there is another way that all of this could be working. It's not only about the narratives that we have about digital media coming from our US perspective, our CMS experience, and the different sort of projects that we've worked on is not the one that would be coming, if you're working in one of these tech companies in the Chinese context, and that would just change overnight if that's what happened to the Pakistani market in terms of digital infrastructure. We'd just be having a different conversation where there wouldn't even be this debate. And so what's universal in that context is not the same, as it is when we're coming from this more American perspective.
Yeah, and I think this sort of goes to the heart of what Ranu's question is trying to get at as well, which is, again, it's this interesting sort of binary way in which we frame the distinction between civil liberties and free speech, right? And then try and figure out on a moment-by-moment basis where regulation needs to have a heavier hand. So she's talking about, for example, the Delhi, what happened in Delhi last year, in Myanmar, in other South Asian contexts, certainly in the diasporic context, like Rekha was pointing out. And there too, it sounds like, Huma, you're pushing back and saying it's not that kind of either or, right? That's not a good way to begin a conversation with any of these platform players between this free speech versus civil liberties. Am I interpreting it correctly?
Yep, that's right. That's right. And I just think it's about sort of it's more that it's not even about how you regulate the space, but sort of the broader conversations that these discussions about media tend to unfold. And so, it is like Parmesh has said, is like we stop to even talk about that basic thing about right to voice, right to access, right to information. And it in an ideal context, it would be those sort of broader guiding principles that would sort of dictate how we are engaging. And instead, the way that we are engaging is this conversation around, well, how do you regulate, which instantly means sort of who, you start to raise those questions of who's getting to regulate, who's getting to participate, who gets to influence that regulation. And then from there, you end up with the different relativist approaches to what the best way to do it would be. But you've lost sight of the bigger point of what we're trying to achieve here. And I think on that, there just obviously isn't any agreement, right?
Yeah, no, and as Rekha said earlier, right, one of the big sort of missing pieces here is any honest accounting of power relations in a particular context, right? And those long histories of marginalization do have a bearing on how we participate in these spaces. And if we don't take those long histories into account, be they certain, like Rekha was pointing out, the way in which caste travels to the diaspora and gets so deeply rooted that without an honest conversation about that, we really can't begin to grapple with certain kinds of right-wing formations. In different contexts, there are different kinds of power relations. So that seems to be a big missing piece of the puzzle in all these conversations that tend to happen in largely tech and business-oriented circles, but don't filter down to the level of what Parmesh would say, sort of the cultural dimension of all of these issues, right? Which is just as crucial as any of the legal, juridical, or explicitly political or business side of things. How do we bring the cultural dimensions of these power relations into play when we're talking about digital platforms and infrastructures? That seems to be just as crucial that the four of us, because of CMS and other background, we have, but it's not necessarily how it plays out. Let's see. There's one other question still, but I think we've sort of circled around this as well, and that has to do with gatekeeping, right? That there always have been gatekeepers with mainstream media institutions and other cultural institutions, but who gets heard, how the gatekeeping function is either similar or different, seems to come up again. And I think we've talked about it in different ways with recommender systems, algorithms, but keeping in mind the unexpected, like Parmesh, you were saying, the way in which new juxtapositions, bringing two partners to speak to each other in a context where otherwise they might not. So Grace Bano talking to a corporate CEO, for example, right, that you were talking about. Are there other things the three of you would like to add to this question of gatekeeping?
Yeah, I've got a sort of, again, an interesting spin on it, which is, so we think as, that when you have gatekeepers, that you start to construct as a result of those gatekeepers a particular kind of discourse or a particular narrative or a particular representation of certain voices, and that's the outcome that you were trying to achieve as a result of actively gatekeeping. But one of the sort of things that I'm working on right now is just looking at sort of one of the sort of interesting repercussions for religious identity formation that's happening as a result of mediated gatekeeping of how religious identity is projected in Pakistan's digital and media landscape. And so the short version of this is that what I'm looking at is the way that we have this new culture of religious talk shows. They're a lot like political talk shows where you get this panel of religious scholars to come in from different perspectives to talk about issues from the ridiculous to the sublime. Whether it could be sort of serious questions around inheritance law in Islam, or it could be questions about can I pray with nail polish on, yes or no. But the goal of these religious panels was to essentially start to celebrate the diversity of religious views in Pakistan, in a country where previously there was this more sort of top-down capitalized Islam that didn't recognize sectarian difference, etc. But we've ended up in a surreal situation where essentially media producers, so young men who are essentially news producers in TV rooms, are getting to be gatekeepers of that religious identity because they get to decide who participates in these talk shows. And of course, what happens there then is that they start to select certain scholars from certain sects that are deemed acceptable within the mainstream narrative of how the state wants to construct an Islamic identity, whereas other subsects of Islam or groups that are perceived by mainstream to be heretical, for example, will never be allowed to participate in those panel discussions. And so you end up having there's that level of gatekeeping in terms of who even gets to participate in the discourse. But because of anxiety that acknowledgement of sort of religious diversity would lead to sectarianism or communalism or some kind of sort of further hostility, there's been intense media regulation in this space. So in Pakistan, you cannot come onto one of these talk shows without sort of signing various forms and disclosure waivers and things saying that when I participate in this show, I will not say anything that is sectarian or hateful. I will not inflame violence against other groups. I will just come and speak in this moderated, tolerant way. And people do largely do that. So you end up with this space where gatekeepers and regulators have created this very sanitized public in pseudo-inclusive religious discourse space. But what is happening as a result of that is that in order to shore up their credentials within different sectarian or violent extremist groupings, people then go back offline and actually adopt even more radical views and sort of push back against their own sanitization or their own moderation by taking even more extreme positions when they're offline or in sort of different spaces or differently moderated WhatsApp groups or whatever it may be. And so you end up with this complete disconnect between, we used to hear that media holds up a mirror to society, but no, not at all, right? So the media is holding up the mirror to this perfectly curated, gate-kept, moderated, sanitized space that has no bearing to what's actually happening in society, which is trying to look quite different as reacting to that.
And we see some of that here, obviously, with MAGA and things like that, where you have, if you want to call them micro or intermediary gatekeepers who are, in the context of a larger ideology, sort of having like little fiefdoms and power and are sort of channeling a larger message, but in very specific ways that can be more extremist. I mean, it's not the same because this is a very specific, but the idea of like, any kind of ideology that then is entrusted in somebody, whoever's in the position to disseminate it to another audience is very powerful. That we think of gatekeepers in a capital way, in sort of big things, but there's a lot happens on various strata of when the message reaches an individual.
Yeah, that was a really good point. The micro gatekeeper is a shockingly powerful thing as well.
I'm sure we could go on for another couple of hours and there's nothing I would like more, but perhaps in person sometime in the near future would be truly lovely, and not these little Zoom mosaic faces, lovely as they are. If I just wanted to leave 2 minutes open to other thoughts you wanted to share that haven't come up necessarily, or any closing remarks about things you're reflecting on about the digital world we inhabit. And if there are no other burning questions from our listeners, I just wanted to say thank you again to the MIT Alumni Association for organizing this, and shout out once more to Thuli Banerjee. I hope you're well and hope to reconnect with Thuli. Maybe all of us can at some point. But yeah, I'll turn it over to all of you for any closing remarks. Yeah, Parmesh, go for it.
I have lots to say about gatekeeping and all that, but forget that. My only closing remark is who has binged the full season of Fabulous Housewives of Bollywood already?
I'm getting there.
Holding off.
And speaking about all those watching, listen, yeah, you can't get so many of us, and we can't talk about Bollywood so little bit.
I was about to go
Uma,
in
do you
on
get
Bollywood.
like?
There's a beautiful thing that's unfolding in real time between Diljit and
Yes.
and
Kangana
what's
Ranaut.
I know, and Kangana.
And Kangana.
And Team Kangana. Team Kangana. It's not her, it's Team
Well,
Kangana.
I mean, this is
Yeah,
interesting.
different.
Like, if we want to bring it back to CMS and gatekeeping, like, you know, you've got hives and teams, and like, there's so much going on. Team Kangana, Team Diljit. What I think.
No, Diljit is only Diljit. Yeah.
No. But there's Punjabis all over
man.
are like rallying behind him and like saying.
This is one of those moments where my South
standing
Indian
up.
heart is like, I wish I knew Punjabi. I want to know more.
Yeah. The other thing about Diljit is he's crossover. He's in Bollywood as well. He's managed to occupy these different spaces. So for him to say that is interesting. And, you know, there's always a deep criticism of Bollywood actors and their position in the state and how cozy they get with Modi and how silent they are on things. And this is such a powerful movement. And, you know, the silence is deafening. And when there's any kind of, you know, I mean, there were some great clips I've been seeing of people saying, you know, all the actors that say they're from Punjab, or they use Punjab as a backdrop and a context for their movies. Like, where are they now? It's really fascinating to see in real time. Yeah. So there you go.
They're all on Fabulous Housewives making a cameo. That's where they are.
Oh, true.
While the real action is happening, of course. Yeah, they're all there.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that at least on this call, we're all Team Diljit. So really, let's
problematic in other ways.
In other ways, but in this moment, in this limited mode, we will root for Diljit and not Kangana. But yeah,
and a lot of Punjabi singers are really stepping up. Yeah. But it's still a very the thing that's also very absent in this protest is like, it's very male dominated, front facing, you know, like, you know, that's definitely it's not just one gender fighting this fight or being affected. So
yeah.
No, this again, just to sort of end on this note, this is an entire world, right? We've barely scratched the surface in terms of the breadth and depth of what's happening in a region like South Asia and its diaspora in relation to digital platforms and infrastructures. I think the one thing we should sort of say is academic and popular discourse tends to always regard media developments in other parts of the world as afterthoughts to what happens in largely Anglophone US and UK contexts. I think it's safe to say that at least where the digital futures are concerned, if those of us involved in all of our different domains, we really need to have our finger on the pulse of what's happening across Asia, across other sort of parts of the global South in various vernacular languages, because those futures are being made and invented as we speak. And it would be a huge mistake to continue to think in this sort of binary way of it first happens in the West and then goes to the rest of the world. That simply has been turned on its head over the last 15, 20 years, as all of you have attested. So I hope that this conversation about South Asia and digital that the MIT South Asian Alumni Association organized, perhaps we can move from here to the entire MIT Alumni Association and have 4 brown people talk about digital instead of tech bros from Silicon Valley, right? So maybe that's a future we can all aspire to. But again, thank you all so much. It was such a joy to see all of you. Rekha, I hope we can meet in person sometime soon. Thank you, Parmesh, for logging on so late at night. And it was just, yeah, I had a great time, and thank you all once more for joining.
Yes, maybe there'll be another CMS conference.
Really, yes. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Reshma and Moana, for all the tech support, for organizing and setting this up so brilliantly. Thank Thank you and bye, everybody.
And thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Arjun, for moderating. It was lovely to
Thank you.
speak to everyone again.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you so much. Take care
Bye.
all.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.